Greetings, you brilliant AP Environmental Science students. Today we're going to delve into the meat of APES topic 1.1, an introduction to ecosystems. And our primary focus is to be able to explain how the availability of resources influences species interactions. And mostly what we'll talk about is how to classify these different types of common interactions among species. So we're going to first begin with the very important term in ecology, which is pronounced ecological niche, or sometimes pronounced ecological niche. It's sort of a tomato comparison. Now, when we talk about niche or niche, it is the role and position a species has in its environment. In other words, we could think of it as how it goes about meeting its needs for food and shelter, how it survives, and how it reproduces. So the niche or niche basically helps to describe the totality of an organism within its environment. Now, a couple of important terms related to niche are the idea of what's called generalist and specialist niches or species. A niche includes all of its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors of its environment, but some species are able to survive and interact in lots of types of habitats, where others require very special or specific habitats. So generalist species have a broad niche. That means they are able to survive in maybe a forest and grassland ecosystems, or maybe they can do well in cold or temperate or warm climates. They have a variety of habitats that they are well suited for. So some examples of species that we see in lots of different types of habitats are deer, coyote, raccoons. They don't really have one specific habitat that they need. They can survive in lots of different habitats. Now contrast that with some species you're also probably familiar with, are specialist species. So pandas, for example, require bamboo forests. They really are only well suited for that very specific type of habitat. Polar bears are another example where they require lots of snow and ice in order to be able to hunt and thrive. So specialist species, special habitat, generalist species, lots of different habitats. Now, when we are talking about two or more organisms within the same habitat, now, sometimes within the types of interactions that can occur, we get what's called competition. And this is typically with similar types of organisms. So whenever they are trying to get to the same resource in an ecosystem, so that means their niches are similar, at least for food or for living space, there's going to be some form of competition for that resource. Now, the competition can be intraspecific, and that just means two individuals from the same species are competing for the same resource. And you might think about that as two male moose, for example, competing with each other to attract the attention of a female moose. That would be an example of intraspecific competition. Now, we're probably more familiar with, or just as familiar with at least, what's called interspecific competition. And that's when we have populations of two or more species competing with each other. So this might be an example of deer and elk. So deer and elk are similar in a lot of ways. They are, however, different species. They don't interbreed and create viable offspring, but they often will be in the same habitat, and therefore, because they are both herbivores or primary consumers, they're often going to be sort of competing with each other for space and food. That is interspecific competition. So when niches overlap, that results in some types of competition. So we have what's called a fundamental and realized niche. So this is what actually occurs in nature. Now, fundamental niche is what would happen if there was no competition, no limiting factors, just how well would that organism do? How well adapted is it to that habitat? We really focus on what's called the realized niche, which is with the presence of other organisms that also are looking for those same resources. How well does that organism actually do? So we're going to use the green and brown anole as our example here. So green anole and brown anole are different species. They don't interbreed to create viable offspring, but they are very similar and therefore require very similar food, living space, and other resources. Now, In the case of green and brown anoles, when they are occupying the same habitat, so where that overlap occurs, competition, interspecific competition occurs. And in this case, the brown anole outcompetes that green anole and essentially shrinks its niche down. That's that idea of realized niche. Green anole doesn't do as well as it would without the presence of the brown anole. Okay, so competitive exclusion versus resource partitioning. So competitive exclusion is similar to what we just saw with the green and brown anole. One species outcompetes the other species from the same niche, and as a result, essentially excludes it. So another example is if we put two bacteria into the same growth medium, sometimes one will outcompete the other and essentially push it out of that growth medium or habitat. So P. aurelia outcompetes P. caudatum and excludes it from that particular habitat or niche. So that is competitive exclusion. Sometimes what happens is what's called resource partitioning. Now, this is a very different result of competition. So as shown in the visual here, we have various species of warblers, which are obviously birds. Now, they're very, very similar to each other, and therefore, if they're in the same habitat, they are going to end up competing with each other for food and living space. Now, an interesting phenomena occurs here is rather than one species or two species outcompeting the others and completely excluding them from the habitat, these birds in particular have altered their niche slightly so that they can coexist within the same habitat and essentially share the resource. Maybe they're slightly different food source that makes them better suited for the exterior fringe of the tree as opposed to the interior. Or maybe they survive better in the lower branches of a tree than the higher branches because of their specific adaptations. So they're not excluding each other from a habitat. They are sort of partitioning out those resources. So when we have competition, sometimes we get competitive exclusion. Sometimes we get resource partitioning. Now, the next type of species interaction is what we call predation. And as simple as it gets, that's when one species eats another species. And that can include plants. Plants can be prey. We often think of predator-prey as one animal eating another animal. An animal eating a plant is also considered predation. It's just broadly defined, one species eats another species. Okay. Now, the most common type of predator-prey interaction, though, is what's called pursuit and ambush. So pursuit is simply means chasing it down and catching it. So you can think about, in this case over here, we have the day gecko chase down and eats that spider. And a lion or a group of lions might chase down and attack and kill an antelope. That's pursuit. Ambush occurs through either attracting a prey with colors or light. So in the case those anglerfish that live in deep water have that bioluminescent trick that attracts various species to the light. Okay, that's an ambush, or sometimes they're camouflaged and they're not sensed or seen by other animals, and so when they walk by, they can pounce and catch their prey that way. So over time, both plants and animals have developed defenses against predation. So plants can't flee, so they're not going to develop an ability to be faster or stronger. What they do develop is things like spikes, thorns, and leathery leaves and thick wax. Or sometimes they can excrete a chemical that tastes really bad or smells really bad or is even poisonous. So those are various types of plant defenses against predation. Animals develop things like being really fast or swift or agile. Sometimes, like in the case of turtles or porcupines, they actually have a mechanical defense. They live in herds or groups, which helps to ensure maybe not every individual survives, but that helps the species to survive. Camouflage and sometimes bright coloring is a warning to predators that they are poisonous, and sometimes they mimic being poisonous with bright coloring, even though they might not actually be poisonous. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is this relationship known as symbiosis. Symbiosis is a broad term that describes a variety of types of reliance. Okay, so this is really important. We have a relationship between species where sometimes they rely on each other, sometimes one relies on the other. But there has to be some sort of intimate reliance of at least one species on the other species for it to be considered symbiosis. All right. Now, in that relationship, participants can benefit, they can be harmed, or they can be unaffected, but at least one has to rely on the other for it to be considered symbiosis. And our three major types are what are called mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, and I'll explain what each of those means in the coming slides. So mutualism implies that two different species rely on each other and benefit. So both species benefit from this relationship. So the example shown here is a relationship between the roots of this tree and a fungus. Okay, so mycorrhizal fungus and plant roots have a mutualistic relationship. And essentially what that looks like is the fungus grows around and into roots, providing roots with otherwise unavailable nitrogen from soil. So the fungus itself actually sort of acts like a fertilizer for the tree, which helps it to grow. And so you can see when we do have that fungus present, the tree itself and the root systems are much more extensive. It acts just like a fertilizer. So the tree benefits by the presence of that fungus. The fungus also benefits because the roots actually provide some food for the plant. Okay, so there it's mutualism because both species benefit. Okay, now we have what's called commensalism, which is similar, but the key difference here is one species relies upon the other and benefits, and the other one is actually essentially just unaffected. It's not helped nor harmed by that relationship. And a really common example of this is what are called epiphytes. So epiphytes are what you're seeing here. They're a variety of plant that anchors itself to the trunk of a tree, often in tropical ecosystems. Now, in this particular instance, the epiphytes benefit by essentially being a little bit higher off the ground in these really dense ecosystems and have a little better access to things like sunlight, better availability of resources. So the epiphytes rely on the tree for that access to the resources it needs. So the epiphyte benefits, the tree itself doesn't benefit, but it does not hurt the tree in any way either. So in that case, we call that type of symbiosis where one relies on the other, one benefits, one is unaffected, as commensalism. And lastly, the third type that we call parasitism. So this is or a parasitic relationship. So again, one species is relying on the other. In this case, however, the parasite itself is benefited from that relationship. The other species is harmed by that relationship. Now, parasites rarely actually kill their host. Sometimes they can, especially with prolonged interaction between the parasite and the host. But it definitely is a win-lose relationship. So the case you're seeing here in the background is what are called varroa mites, which get into the tissues of honeybees. So they essentially live and feed off the honeybees, but don't directly kill them in the sense that like a predator would do. So it's a reliance where one species benefits, one is harmed. Another example of parasites might be a tapeworm or a leech or a tick. The tick would be the parasite. Whatever the tick is feeding upon would be the one that's negatively impacted. All three of those count as symbiosis. Okay, the defining characteristic between them is whether they both benefit, one benefits or one is benefits and the other is harmed.